It was Christmas Eve, and I was driving home after spending the day with some friends. The weather was bitterly cold, with light snow falling and swirling under the glow of the streetlights. I had stayed later than I'd planned, and by the time I started my drive, the streets were nearly empty. It was just me, the hum of my car's heater, and the occasional flash of headlights passing in the other direction. The highway stretched endlessly through the snowy countryside, flanked by dense rows of pine trees on either side. I turned on the radio to fill the silence, flipping through stations until I found some quiet Christmas music. For a while, it felt peaceful, almost serene. But then I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A lone figure stood on the shoulder of the road up ahead, their silhouette illuminated faintly by my car's headlights. As I got closer, I saw the man was wearing a long, heavy coat and a scarf that partially covered his face. His hand was raised in the universal hitchhiker gesture, thumb pointing upward. I hesitated. Normally, I wouldn't stop for a hitchhiker, especially not at night. But it was Christmas Eve, and the man looked frozen. The temperature outside was well below freezing, and I couldn't just leave him out there. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. The man approached the passenger side window as I rolled it down slightly. Up close, he looked pale, his cheeks red from the cold, but there was something off about his expression. It was blank, almost too calm. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Just up the road," he replied, his voice low and flat. "If you could drop me off at the next town, I'd appreciate it." I hesitated but nodded, unlocking the door. He climbed in without saying another word, shutting the door behind him with a heavy thud. The car was silent except for the sound of the heater and the faint hum of the radio. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me as I drove. For the first few minutes, the man didn't speak. He sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. I tried to make conversation to break the tension. "Pretty cold out there tonight," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Yes," he replied, his voice clipped and emotionless. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His face was turned slightly toward the window, but he wasn't looking at the passing trees or the snow-covered fields. He was staring at his own reflection in the glass, unmoving. "Do you live around here?" I asked, trying again. "No," he said simply. The conversation went dead again. My hands tightened on the wheel as the unease grew. Something about him felt wrong. He wasn't acting aggressive or threatening, but his silence and strange demeanor set my nerves on edge. I kept my eyes on the road, counting the minutes until we'd reach the next town. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped for me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at him, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were cold and empty, like two dark voids. "It's dangerous," he said, "picking up strangers on the road. You never know who you're letting into your car." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the fear creeping up my throat. "Well," I said, forcing a nervous laugh, "I guess it's a good thing you're not dangerous." He didn't smile. He didn't even blink. Instead, he looked back out the window and fell silent again. We drove for another mile in tense silence before I spotted the lights of the next town in the distance. Relief washed over me. "Almost there," I said, more to myself than to him. But as I turned onto the main street, he suddenly leaned forward. "Stop here," he said, his voice sharper now. I pulled over near a dimly lit diner, the only building that seemed to be open at this hour. He opened the door and stepped out into the snow, but before shutting it, he turned back to me. "Thank you for the ride," he said, his tone flat again. "And Merry Christmas." I nodded, watching as he walked toward the diner without looking back. I waited a moment, half expecting him to turn around, but he didn't. Finally, I drove off, eager to put the strange encounter behind me. But the story doesn't end there. A week later, I was driving along the same stretch of highway when I saw a roadside memorial I hadn't noticed before. Curious, I slowed down and pulled over. The memorial was simple. A wooden cross surrounded by a few wilted flowers and a small plaque. The inscription read, In loving memory of Matthew Collins. Gone too soon. December 24th, 2017. My stomach turned as I stared at the date. It was the same night I had picked up the hitchhiker. A chill ran through me as I realized the man I had given a ride to looked eerily similar to the face on the faded photo attached to the memorial. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I really picked up a ghost? Or was it just a coincidence? My mind playing tricks on me? I'll never know for sure. But every time I drive that highway now, I can't help but glance at the shoulder of the road, half expecting to see him standing there again, waiting for another ride. Last December, my friends and I decided to rent a remote cabin for a weekend getaway before the holidays. The idea was to escape the city, enjoy the snow, and just unwind with hot cocoa and board games. The cabin we picked was about 3 hours away, tucked deep into a forest at the edge of a small, rural town. The drive there was uneventful, and by the time we arrived, the sun was already setting. The cabin was charming, rustic but well-maintained, with a wood-burning fireplace and large windows that looked out onto the snowy clearing. Beyond the clearing was a wall of dense trees that seemed to stretch forever. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, but we didn't think much of it at the time. The first night was exactly what we had hoped for. We cooked dinner, laughed over old stories, and played cards by the fire until we were too tired to keep our eyes open. By the time we went to bed, the world outside was a blanket of undisturbed snow, glistening under the moonlight. The next morning, I was the first to wake up. I shuffled into the kitchen to make coffee, still groggy, and glanced out the window as I waited for the water to boil. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the snow. They started at the edge of the clearing, just where the trees began, and led straight toward the cabin. My stomach tightened as I realized the prints didn't go back. Whoever or whatever had made them had approached the cabin but hadn't left. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was probably one of my friends messing around. After all, we were surrounded by forest. It wasn't that weird for someone to explore a little, right? Still, I decided to ask when everyone woke up. Over breakfast, I casually brought it up. So, which one of you went out into the snow last night? The table went silent. My friends exchanged confused glances before one of them, Sarah, laughed nervously. None of us went outside. Why would we? It's freezing. I could tell by their reactions that they weren't lying. My unease grew, but I didn't want to ruin the mood, so I brushed it off. Must have been a deer or something, I said, though the tracks were far too large and too perfectly human for that to be true. As the day went on, the incident faded to the back of my mind. We spent most of the day sledding, building snowmen, and exploring the area around the cabin. By the time the sun started to set, we were exhausted but happy, ready for another cozy night by the fire. That evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Sarah froze mid-sentence and pointed toward the large window in the living room. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all turned to look, but there was nothing there. "See what?" I asked. "I don't know," she said, frowning. "I thought I saw someone." Standing by the tree line, the room went quiet as we stared out into the clearing. The snow glowed faintly under the moonlight, but the trees beyond were shrouded in shadow. There was no movement, no sign of anyone or anything out there. After a few tense moments, we decided it was probably her imagination. Still, we made sure all the doors and windows were locked before settling in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It was faint at first, a soft crunching sound, but as I listened, it grew louder. Someone or something was walking through the snow outside. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound circled the cabin, pausing occasionally, as if whoever it was listening or watching. I crept out of bed and peeked through the curtains. The clearing was empty, but the footprints were back. Fresh ones, leading from the trees directly to the cabin. I swallowed hard, my breath fogging up the cold glass. The prints stopped just below my window. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't frantic or loud, just a soft, deliberate knock. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. Who would be out here at this hour? And why would they knock so calmly? I crept toward the living room, where my friends were now stirring, clearly woken by the sound. Sarah whispered, "Don't answer it." We all nodded in agreement. Instead, we stood there, holding our breath, as the knocking came again. This time, it was louder. "Who's there?" One of my friends called out, their voice trembling. No response. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side wasn't in a hurry. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. We didn't dare move for several minutes, too afraid to even look out the window. The next morning, we found more footprints in the snow. They circled the cabin several times before disappearing back into the woods. We also found something else, an old rusted lantern sitting on the porch. None of us recognized it, and it clearly hadn't been there the day before. We decided to cut the trip short and leave that afternoon. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch what looked like movement in the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We never found out who or what was outside the cabin that night. But I'll never forget the way those knocks sounded in the dead of night, or the sight of those footprints leading to every window, stopping just short of the door. It was a freezing December evening, just a week before Christmas, and my dad and I had arrived early at our family's cabin near Lake Tahoe. The rest of the family, my mom and my younger brother, Ethan, were staying behind in the city to finish work and school before joining us for the holidays. Our cabin was at the end of a quiet road surrounded by dense pine trees. The area was serene but eerily still during the winter, especially when most of the other cabins nearby were empty. My dad busied himself setting up the place, turning on the heat, getting the water running, and making everything livable again after months of being unused. Meanwhile, I set up my game console in my room and spent most of the first day immersed in video games. That night, the snowstorm hit. It blanketed the entire area with 2 feet of fresh powder, making everything outside look like a picturesque winter wonderland. It was the kind of snow that made everything seem even quieter than usual. The next morning, as I shuffled into the kitchen for breakfast, my dad greeted me with an unexpected question. "When did you have time to build a snowman?" I blinked at him, confused. "I didn't build any snowman," I replied. He gestured toward the backyard window. "Then who built that?" I walked over to look, and there it was, a perfectly shaped snowman sitting in the middle of our backyard. It had 2 stick arms reaching upward, and its face was carved with an unsettling grin, its empty eyes staring directly at the window where we stood. My dad chuckled and shrugged. "Probably one of the neighbor's kids. Looks like a prank." He didn't seem concerned, so I tried not to be either. After all, it was just a snowman, right? That night, as I lay in bed, I woke suddenly to the sound of a sharp thump against my window. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I froze under the covers. My room was on the 2nd floor, which made it impossible for anything or anyone to reach the window from outside. I told myself it must have been snow falling from the roof, but curiosity got the better of me. I hesitated, then peeked out from behind the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, just a few feet from the house, stood another snowman. This one wasn't in the backyard, but directly beneath my window. Unlike the first, its face wasn't smiling. It had an angry, twisted frown carved into it, and its stick arms pointed accusingly upward, toward me. I screamed and bolted out of my room, waking my dad. When I dragged him to the window, the color drained from his face. He muttered something about kids taking it too far, and promised to speak to the neighbors in the morning. I didn't sleep in my room that night. I stayed in the guest room, too frightened to go back. The next day, my dad visited the only cabin nearby that was occupied, a family with 2 young children. But when he returned, he looked more unsettled than before. "No one's there," he said. "Their driveway is empty, and it looks like they've been gone for days." We tried to move past it, chalking the incidents up to a prank by someone we hadn't noticed. For the next few nights, nothing else happened, and I began to relax. By Christmas Eve, The rest of the family had joined us, filling the cabin with laughter and the smell of my mom's cooking. For a while, the strange events felt like a distant memory. But then came the knock at the door. It was after dark, and we weren't expecting anyone. The knock was heavy and deliberate, and it echoed through the living room, silencing our conversations. My dad approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called. A voice replied, muffled by the heavy wood. "Please, I need help. Let me in." We all exchanged uneasy glances. My dad pressed on. "What's wrong?" "I have nowhere to go," the voice said, trembling but insistent. "Please, let me spend Christmas with you." My mom whispered, "Don't open the door," her voice filled with fear. My dad straightened and said firmly, "You need to leave, or I'll call the police." There was a long pause, and then the voice replied, softer now, "Okay, I'll leave. Don't call the police." We heard footsteps crunching in the snow as the person walked away. My dad never opened the door. The next morning, Christmas Day, we found a note taped to the door. Scrawled in uneven handwriting, it read, "I just wanted to make your holiday a little more fun. I built the snowmen for the boy in the house. I don't have anyone to spend Christmas with. Don't be mad." I felt a chill reading it. Whoever left that note wasn't joking. They were watching us. Watching me. My dad crumpled the note and threw it away, but we couldn't shake the unease it left behind. We never found out who built the snowmen or knocked on the door that night, but I'm convinced it wasn't just a harmless prank. Whether that person was dangerous or just deeply unstable, there's someone I hope to never meet.